Today, we take a look at the most horrifying pet attacks on their owners, from a rehabilitation specialist's dangerous demonstration to an animal dealer's birthday celebration that went horribly wrong. It was May 29th, 2015, in a quiet suburban neighborhood on the east side of Dayton, Ohio. The late afternoon sun fell across trimmed lawns and chain-link fences. Inside one small, single-story home, a decision was made that would turn a calm Friday into a fatal event. Carla Dawson was a 52-year-old veterinary technician who had spent much of her adult life working with difficult animals, particularly dogs with a history of biting. In 2009, she developed a strong interest in primates after visiting a private breeder in Indiana. Later that year, she purchased a 2-year-old male chimpanzee she named Milo, and over the next 6 years, she kept him in a reinforced enclosure in her home, feeding him a varied diet and engaging him with puzzles and toys. She believed her background gave her an advantage in understanding his moods and limits. Carla likely wasn't aware of the fundamental nature of the primate she had raised. Adult male chimpanzees can weigh up to 200 pounds and possess strength 5 times greater than an average human male. Their massive jaws can exert a bite force of over 1,300 pounds per square inch, easily capable of crushing bone. Male chimps, even when hand-raised, grow territorial and may attack with sudden, unpredictable precision, often targeting the face, hands, and genitals. By 2015, Milo had grown far beyond the playful juvenile she first brought home. He weighed 170 pounds, stood over 4 feet tall, and had the strength to bend metal bars in his cage if agitated. Friends and neighbors had noticed changes in his behavior: louder vocalizations, longer episodes of pacing, sudden swipes toward the cage door. Carla downplayed concerns, saying he was restless but manageable. She insisted he was affectionate with her and that their bond made him no more dangerous than a large dog. On the day in question, she had invited her sister Alice and Alice's 14-year-old son over for a visit. The house was small and tidy, with the enclosed area for Milo occupying much of the converted dining room. The enclosure had double-latched doors, climbing branches, and a heavy chain for securing the main gate. The faint rustle and guttural grunts from the enclosure could be heard from the kitchen. That afternoon, Alice noticed Milo's body language as Carla approached the enclosure. His shoulders were high and rigid, his eyes wide, his lips pressed tight. Carla mentioned letting him out for a short time to show how affectionate he could be. Alice hesitated, pointing out his pacing and the low, intermittent hoots coming from him. Carla dismissed the concerns, saying he was just excited. Moments before opening the gate, Milo gave a sharp, breathy pant, an alert behavior in chimpanzees. But Carla did not pause. The moment the latch was undone, Milo charged forward with explosive force, striking Carla in the chest and knocking her to the floor. Alice later told police that the first sound was a deep, guttural scream, followed by the rapid thump of his hands hitting the floor as he lunged. Milo seized Carla's forearm in his jaws, tearing through skin and muscle with devastating efficiency. His grip was so strong that when she tried to pull away, he dragged her closer, his feet gripping the carpet for leverage. Alice shouted for help and tried to pull Milo away by the shoulders, but he struck her across the face with one arm, sending her stumbling. She ran to the door, yelling into the street. 2 neighbors, hearing the commotion, entered with shovels. They struck Milo's back and sides repeatedly, but he did not release his hold. His focus had shifted to Carla's head and neck, and blood had begun to pool on the carpet. Screams were audible to people 2 houses away, and their neighbors alerted the authorities. In desperation, Alice ran to the kitchen for a knife, but when she returned, Milo had dragged Carla toward a corner near the cage. Blood smeared across the floor and onto the wall where her head had struck. The knife was too small to be effective against his grip, and Alice could not get close without being swiped at. Police arrived within minutes. The front door was partially open, and they could see movement inside. Upon entry, officers shouted to distract Milo, but he remained hunched over Carla. One officer fired 2 rounds from his service weapon. Milo released her and staggered toward the enclosure before collapsing. EMTs entered seconds later, but Carla's injuries were catastrophic. Massive blood loss, deep cranial trauma, and severe damage to her face and arms. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Her body was taken to the county coroner's office, while Milo's remains were removed by animal control for necropsy. The enclosure showed signs of wear at the latch and denting on one of the interior bars, consistent with reports of his earlier attempts to push out. Carla's funeral took place the following Tuesday. Attendance was small: family, a few close friends, and 2 former co-workers from the veterinary clinic. The service was brief, with no public remarks about the circumstances of her death. Dayton authorities issued a statement reminding residents about Ohio's exotic animal ownership laws, which had been updated in 2014 after several other incidents in the state. The enclosure was dismantled and discarded. Carla's tragic misunderstanding of primates served as a reminder that wild instincts cannot be domesticated away. However, in the rugged mountains of Montana, a retiree's belief in his bond with a mountain lion would cause him his demise. It was September 11, 2016, in rural Butte County, Montana. The air was cool and still after a night of light frost, and the pale sunlight touched the yellowing grass around the scattered properties. On the edge of one dirt road sat Alan Price's weathered single-story home, a high-fenced pen visible from the driveway. Inside it, a full-grown mountain lion paced slowly, its movements deliberate and fluid. Alan Price was a 67-year-old retired copper miner who had spent decades underground before retiring in 2011. He was known among neighbors as quiet but stubborn, a man who preferred fixing his own problems to asking for help. 4 years earlier, during a late-season hunt, he claimed to have found a cougar cub alone near a kill site. Convinced its mother was gone, he brought it home. Over time, he built a sturdy pen with steel posts and chain-link fencing, and he named the animal Scout. He hand-fed Scout from infancy, telling friends the animal knew him like family. Mountain lions are the largest wild cats in North America, with adult males typically weighing between 110 and 180 pounds and measuring up to 8 feet in length. These powerful predators can leap over 20 feet in a single bound and reach speeds of 50 miles per hour in short bursts. Cougars use massive jaws to crush windpipes or sever spines, 2-inch claws to grip and tear, and retain full predatory instincts, even after years in captivity. In the years since bringing Scout home, Alan's life revolved around the cougar's care. He bought venison and beef scraps from a local butcher, cleaned the pen himself, and occasionally let visitors watch feeding time. He dismissed the frequent warnings from friends, relatives, and neighbors that Scout was no longer a cub. To Alan, the trust built over years was enough. Even as Scout's growls deepened and its posture became more defensive, during feedings that summer, he viewed it as part of the animal's personality rather than a threat. Alan's property sat among rolling hills dotted with pine and aspen, with old mining roads threading into the back country. The pen stood at the far end of his yard, shaded on one side by a corrugated metal awning and open on the other to the sunlight. On the morning of the attack, the ground was dry, with patches of frost in shadowed areas. Over the years, several people had urged Alan to stop entering the pen, especially alone. In July, a neighbor noticed Scout crouching low and locking eyes on Alan during feeding. In August, a local game warden stopped by after a report of loud snarling and advised caution. Just a week before the attack, One of Alan's friends mentioned that Scout had flattened its ears when Alan reached for the feeding bowl. Each time, Alan waved off the concern, saying the animal was just keyed up before eating. On the morning of his birthday, Alan invited 2 friends, both retired miners, to watch him feed Scout by hand. The animal was pacing the pen when they arrived, its tail twitching slightly. Alan carried in a bucket of meat scraps, unlocked the gate, and stepped inside without hesitation. One of the men noticed Scout crouching again, its body tight and focused. Alan laughed when the man pointed it out and continued walking toward the feeding area in the back corner. The moment Alan bent to set down the meat, Scout lunged instantly. The cougar covered the distance in 2 bounds, slamming into Alan's upper back and driving him to the ground. Its claws tore through his jacket and shirt, raking deep into his shoulders. Witnesses later described the sound of the impact as dull and heavy, followed by Alan's grunt. Scout's jaws locked on the back of his skull, and the animal's hindquarters bunched as it adjusted its grip. Alan tried to roll sideways, but Scout's full weight pressed him down. The 2 men outside the pen shouted and threw a nearby bucket against the fence, but the animal didn't flinch. One ran to the gate and stepped in a few feet, yanking at Scout's tail. The cougar released the bite momentarily to twist and swipe, its forepaw catching the man's cheek and opening a deep cut. The man staggered back, retreating to the fence. Alan's movements slowed as Scout clamped down again, its teeth sinking into the skull. Blood pooled on the dirt beneath them. The second man called 911, describing the attack in short bursts between shouts to distract the animal. For several minutes, Scout maintained its position, shifting only to adjust its bite. Deputies arrived after 8 minutes, rifles ready. They advanced to the gate, one shouting to draw Scout's attention. When the animal didn't release, a deputy fired once, striking it in the side. Scout collapsed, releasing Alan and twitching briefly before going still. Alan lay face down, his clothing torn in several places, with deep gouges across his torso and head. Paramedics confirmed he was dead at the scene. Scout's carcass was removed by Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks for examination, confirming it was in good health and well-fed at the time of the attack. The funeral took place 5 days later in a small chapel in Butte, with only a few relatives, neighbors, and former co-workers attending. Several locals later admitted they had expected such an outcome, though none said so publicly at the time. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks issued a statement reiterating the dangers of keeping large carnivores, noting that existing state regulations already prohibited public exhibition without a permit, but allowed private ownership under certain conditions. However, even as Alan's story became a warning that wild animals remain dangerous regardless of bond, miles away in the humid heat of Florida, a young mechanic's decision to drape his python around his shoulders would trigger its ancient killing instinct. It was a humid July afternoon in 2014, the Florida heat settling over the quiet suburban streets of Clearwater like a heavy blanket. A 16-foot Burmese python lay coiled in its glass enclosure, in a garage, which would soon be a horror setting. Randy Cole was a 29-year-old auto mechanic who spent his days fixing engines at a small independent shop downtown. His colleagues knew him as meticulous and patient, someone who would stay late to get a difficult repair exactly right. But Randy's true passion lay with reptiles, a hobby that had evolved from keeping small corn snakes as a teenager to housing increasingly dangerous species in his garage. His prized possession was Zeus, a massive Burmese python he had acquired illegally from a reptile expo 2 years earlier. Randy believed his regular handling sessions made the snake docile and predictable. He would drape Zeus across his shoulders while explaining to visitors that consistent interaction created a bond between handler and animal. This belief would prove tragically misguided. Burmese pythons are among the world's largest snakes, capable of exceeding 20 feet in length and weighing over 200 pounds. These massive constrictors possess incredible muscular strength, able to exert pressures exceeding 90 pounds per square inch with their coils. Their killing method is brutally efficient. They wrap around their prey and tighten with each exhale, cutting off blood flow and preventing the lungs from expanding until cardiac arrest occurs. That Friday afternoon, Randy planned to photograph Zeus before the weekly feeding. His roommate Kevin had grown accustomed to these sessions, though he preferred to avoid being present when live rabbits were involved. Randy claimed feeding live prey was more natural, despite warnings from experienced keepers about the increased aggression this could trigger. Randy slid open the enclosure's top panel and carefully lifted Zeus out, the snake's substantial weight requiring both arms to support. The python's head moved slowly at first, tongue flicking to taste the air, while its muscular body shifted in deliberate coils across Randy's shoulders. A live rabbit waited in a small cage on the concrete floor, filling the air with the scent that would trigger Zeus's feeding response. Randy adjusted the snake's position and reached for his phone, wanting to capture a selfie before the feeding began. Kevin stood near the doorway, watching as Zeus's body seemed to tighten slightly around Randy's torso. Then everything changed in an instant. Zeus's movement transformed from the lazy shifting of a handled snake to the lightning-fast strike of an apex predator. The python's coils locked around Randy's chest and neck with devastating precision, pinning his arms against his sides. Randy staggered backward into the workbench, sending tools clattering to the concrete floor as he fought desperately against the constricting coils. Kevin rushed forward, grabbing at the snake's muscular body and trying to pry the coils loose, but Zeus only tightened his grip. Each breath Randy managed to take allowed the python to contract further, the coils working like a biological vice that grew tighter with every passing second. Within minutes, Randy's breathing became labored and then stopped entirely. Kevin grabbed a knife from the tool rack but couldn't find an angle to cut without risking further injury to his roommate. In desperation, he seized a crowbar and tried to wedge it between the coils and Randy's torso, but the steel barely penetrated the shifting muscle mass. Kevin's frantic 911 call brought paramedics and animal control officers racing to the scene. The confined space of the garage made their work difficult, forcing responders to coordinate carefully in the tight quarters. Using specialized snake handling equipment and their combined strength, they managed to secure Zeus's head and slowly unwound the deadly coils from Randy's motionless body. Despite immediate resuscitation efforts, Randy had already succumbed to asphyxiation. Zeus was secured in a transport container and removed from the scene. The official report listed death by constriction with no contributing medical factors. Zeus was later euthanized and sent to the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission for examination. Randy's funeral was held in a small Clearwater chapel, with his parents, co-workers, and a handful of fellow reptile enthusiasts quietly filling the pews. The service was brief, marked by subdued condolences and a few framed photos of Randy smiling with far less dangerous pets from his younger years. Randy's misplaced trust in a serpent proved that predatory instincts cannot be tamed through years of handling. Meanwhile, in Louisiana, a landscaper's relationship with his alligator would end in the murky waters of a pond. It was October 3rd, 2017, in Lafayette Parish, Louisiana. The late afternoon air hung thick with humidity, and a thin haze drifted over the shallow pond behind Jerry LeBlanc's modest home. A dark shape floated motionless just beneath the rippling waterline, waiting with the patience of an owned killer. Jerry LeBlanc was a 45-year-old landscaping contractor whose years of outdoor work had left his skin deeply weathered and his forearms corded with muscle. He was meticulous about maintaining lawns and hedges, but dangerously casual about risk assessment. 10 years earlier, while clearing a drainage ditch, Jerry had discovered a small alligator hatchling. Instead of reporting it to wildlife authorities as required by law, he decided to build a fenced pond in his backyard and keep the animal as an exotic pet. Jerry named his illegal captive Gaston and spent the next decade hand-feeding it chicken scraps and fish. He would often demonstrate to visitors how the alligator would swim toward his voice, interpreting this conditioned feeding response as recognition and affection. Friends and family viewed his hobby as eccentric and reckless, but Jerry insisted the relationship was harmless. He had convinced himself that years of interaction had created a bond that transcended the animal's predatory nature. American alligators can grow over 13 feet in length and weigh more than 1,000 pounds. Their bite force exceeds 2,900 pounds per square inch, making it one of the most powerful in the animal kingdom. These apex predators are perfectly designed killing machines, capable of explosive bursts of speed in water and equipped with a hunting technique called the death roll, where they spin rapidly to disorient and drown their prey. The pond occupied most of Jerry's backyard, enclosed by a chain-link fence that provided little actual security. Cattails grew along the edges, providing cover for an animal that had evolved to be an ambush predator. Over the years, Gaston had grown to over 10 feet in length and weighed several hundred pounds, but Jerry continued to treat him as though he were still the harmless hatchling he had found a decade earlier. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, neighbors had reported hearing unusually loud splashing and bellowing from the pond, especially during nighttime hours. One witness observed Gaston lunging aggressively at a heron that had landed too close to the water's edge. Jerry dismissed these warning signs, attributing the increased activity to warm weather rather than recognizing the escalating aggression of a large predator that had been conditioned to associate humans with food. That fateful afternoon, Jerry's cousin stopped by for a visit, and Jerry decided to provide a demonstration of his supposed control over the massive reptile. He walked barefoot down the muddy bank and stepped into the pond until the water reached his waist, holding raw chicken in one hand as bait. Gaston's head surfaced approximately 20 feet away, his yellow eyes fixed forward with predatory focus. The alligator approached slowly at first, gliding through the water with deceptive calm. Jerry extended his arm, calling the animal closer. His cousin later reported that Gaston's pace quickened dramatically as he closed the final few feet between them. Without warning, the alligator surged upward, his massive jaws opening wide before clamping down on Jerry's forearm. The sound of teeth meeting bone was audible from the shore, a sharp crack that echoed across the water. Jerry screamed and attempted to yank himself free, but Gaston's grip was absolute. Then came the death roll. Gaston twisted violently in the water, his powerful body spinning with Jerry still clamped in his jaws. The water frothed and churned as Jerry disappeared beneath the surface, his legs briefly visible before vanishing in the violent turbulence. The cousin grabbed a garden rake and ran to the water's edge, striking desperately at the alligator's armored hide. But the animal was beyond deterrence. Gaston executed another roll, the water erupting again before settling into expanding rings of ripples. Jerry's head broke the surface for a brief instant, his mouth open as he fought for air, before the alligator's massive body curved around him and dragged him under once more. The cousin continued striking at the water, but Gaston remained submerged with his prey. For several terrifying seconds, the only sign of the struggle below was a stream of bubbles rising and bursting on the surface. Then the pond went completely still, the silence broken only by the distant sound of emergency sirens responding to the cousin's frantic 911 call. Authorities arrived within minutes, entering the murky water with poles and hooks in a coordinated recovery effort. After 20 minutes of searching, Jerry's body was located near the far bank. His right arm showed catastrophic damage from the alligator's bite, and his lungs were filled with pond water. The official cause of death was drowning, with severe trauma as a contributing factor. Wildlife agents eventually captured the massive reptile using specialized equipment and transported him to a secure facility. Given his size, history of human conditioning, and confirmed fatal attack, authorities made the decision to euthanize the animal. Jerry's funeral was held quietly in a small Lafayette chapel, attended primarily by family members and close friends. Authorities issued a reminder that keeping alligators without proper permits is illegal, and that feeding wild animals creates dangerous behavioral patterns that can prove fatal. Yet even as this incident with an alligator served as a grim testament to the unchanging instincts of apex predators, in the dusty plains of Texas, a man's playful interaction with his Bengal tiger would awaken its killing fury. It was April 22, 2013, on the rural outskirts of Amarillo, Texas. The morning was calm, the air still carrying the cool edge of early spring. On Robert Bobby Klein's land, the chain-link walls of a large animal enclosure stood quiet, giving no sign of the violence that would soon erupt within. Bobby was a 38-year-old scrap metal dealer who had lived in the area his whole life. His weathered hands and confident demeanor reflected years of working with heavy machinery and dangerous equipment. In 2010, through a private exotic breeder, he had purchased a Bengal tiger cub he named Raja. At first, the animal was small enough to carry, and Bobby often showed him off to visitors like a prized possession. Over 3 years, Raja had grown into a 400-pound killing machine, but Bobby's habits remained unchanged. He continued entering the enclosure without barriers, convinced he had earned the tiger's trust through daily interaction. The property reflected Bobby's utilitarian approach to life. The tiger's enclosure was a reinforced chain-link pen with a concrete base and a small shelter at the far end. Claw marks lined the wooden posts near the shelter, and the ground was hard-packed from years of pacing. That morning, 2 of Bobby's co-workers had stopped by after a scrap delivery and lingered by the enclosure fence. The morning sunlight slanted across Raja's striped coat as the tiger paced in slow arcs, his tail flicking with growing agitation. The pen carried the sharp scent of ammonia from old straw bedding mixed with the musky odor of a large predator. Bobby carried a large slab of beef into the pen, his co-workers watching from outside the fence. Raja immediately fixed his gaze on the meat, his body lowering into a hunting crouch as he approached. Instead of placing the food down and retreating to safety, Bobby gripped one edge of the beef and pulled it away when Raja tried to take it. Witnesses later described how he seemed to treat the interaction like a game, smiling as the tiger's movements grew increasingly aggressive. The fatal mistake came in Bobby's misunderstanding of predator psychology. Tigers are solitary hunters, programmed by millions of years of evolution to view any interference with their food as a direct challenge. Feeding time triggers heightened arousal and territorial aggression, transforming even seemingly docile captive animals into lethal predators. Bobby's playful tugging was interpreted by Raja as competition for resources, activating every predatory instinct the tiger possessed. Bengal tigers are among the most powerful cats on Earth, capable of weighing up to 660 pounds and reaching speeds of 40 miles per hour in short bursts. Their massive jaws can exert over 1,000 pounds of pressure per square inch, enough to crush the skull of a water buffalo. Their 4-inch canine teeth are designed to puncture vital organs and sever spinal cords with surgical precision. The attack erupted without warning. Raja lunged forward with explosive power, his 400-pound frame slamming into Bobby's torso with the force of a small car. The impact knocked Bobby off his feet, driving the air from his lungs. In the same fluid motion, Raja's massive jaws clamped around Bobby's left side, 4-inch canines puncturing through clothing and flesh. Bobby's scream echoed across the property as he desperately tried to push at the tiger's head with his bare hands. Raja braced his powerful forelegs against Bobby's body, using his weight advantage to drag his prey toward the shelter. The tiger's jaws worked with mechanical precision, adjusting grip and applying crushing pressure that shattered ribs and punctured vital organs. One co-worker sprinted toward the house to retrieve a shotgun, while the other remained, shouting and throwing rocks through the fence in a desperate attempt to distract the predator. Raja seemed to ignore the commotion completely. His focus narrowed to the kill. His head shifted in small, violent movements that tore flesh and muscle, each adjustment of his grip causing massive internal damage. Bobby's screams became ragged gasps as Raja repositioned his jaws around his neck. Blood soaked through his shirt and pooled rapidly beneath his body, the concrete floor becoming slick with crimson. The tiger's bite had severed major arteries, and Bobby was bleeding out with terrifying speed. By the time the shotgun arrived, Raja had dragged Bobby against the back wall of the shelter, his prey now motionless beneath him. The co-worker fired through the chain link at close range, the blast striking the tiger's shoulder and chest. Raja collapsed instantly, his massive body falling partially over Bobby's legs. The surviving co-worker rushed into the pen as soon as the gate was unlatched, pulling Bobby's lifeless form from beneath the dead tiger. The co-worker alerted the authorities immediately. First responders arrived within minutes, but paramedics pronounced Bobby dead at the scene. The primary cause was massive blood loss from deep puncture wounds to the torso and neck, injuries consistent with a large predator attack. His body bore the unmistakable marks of a tiger's killing bite, wounds that would have been fatal within minutes. Texas wildlife officials supervised the removal of Raja's blood-stained carcass. Authorities confirmed that Bobby had not held proper permits for dangerous exotic animals, though big cat ownership remained legal in parts of Texas. The funeral was held 3 days later in a private service at a small local chapel, where family members and close friends gathered in silence. Local officials attended offering quiet condolences. It was March 15, 2014, in Whitefish, Montana. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of the Flathead Valley as Marcus Chen unlocked the gates of Wild Haven Sanctuary. The 47-acre property had been his world for 3 years since inheriting it from his uncle. But more importantly, it was home to Raja, the 400-pound Bengal tiger who had become like a son to him. The sanctuary sat nestled between towering pines and overlooked Whitefish Lake, providing the perfect haven for 12 exotic animals. Marcus had bottle-fed Raja as a 6-month-old cub after the tiger arrived, malnourished from a failed circus. Night after night, Marcus slept beside Raja's enclosure during those early months, nursing him back to health with parental devotion. Their morning routine had become sacred. Marcus would enter with breakfast while Raja would greet him with gentle chuffs, often nuzzling against his legs like an oversized house cat. Marcus knew every scar on Raja's golden coat, every preference in his diet, every subtle mood change in his amber eyes, treating each milestone like a proud father would. The bond transcended typical animal keeper relationships. Marcus celebrated Raja's birthday each year with special treats, spoke to him in Mandarin during daily walks, and often fell asleep reading beside the fence, while Raja dozed nearby. When local officials pressured Marcus to install additional barriers, he felt personally insulted. They didn't understand that Raja trusted him completely after 3 years of unwavering care. Marcus had even named Raja after his late grandfather, believing the tiger carried the same gentle spirit. Visitors often watched in amazement as Raja would follow Marcus around like a devoted pet. That morning, Marcus was running late after staying up all night nursing a sick lynx back to health. 5 new volunteers waited nervously for their orientation tour as Marcus hurriedly grabbed Raja's breakfast from the refrigeration unit. Raja's feeding schedule had been disrupted by over an hour, something that had never happened in their 3-year routine. The presence of 5 unfamiliar faces gathered outside the enclosure also created an unusual tension, as Raja had grown accustomed to their private morning ritual. Bengal tigers are apex predators possessing bite forces exceeding 1,000 psi, while retaining their predatory instincts, regardless of human bonds formed in captivity. Their 4-inch canine teeth and retractable claws are specifically designed for killing prey, while their 400-pound muscular frames can generate explosive power, covering distances in milliseconds. Even hand-raised tigers maintain their wild nature, with hunting reflexes that can trigger without warning despite years of apparent domestication. Disrupted feeding schedules and the presence of strangers can heighten stress levels in captive big cats, making them unpredictable. Marcus entered the enclosure as he had over 1,000 times before, speaking softly to Raja, who approached with apparent affection. However, Raja's behavior seemed slightly different, more alert, his amber eyes occasionally glancing toward the unfamiliar volunteers watching from outside the fence. The tiger's hunger from the delayed feeding made him more focused on the meat bucket than usual. As Marcus began distributing chunks of meat across the wooden feeding platform, Raja's agitation from the disrupted routine and strange observers reached a critical point. When Marcus turned his back to retrieve more meat, the combination of hunger, stress, and unfamiliar circumstances triggered Raja's predatory response. This simple movement triggered Raja's predatory instincts instantly. The tiger launched forward without warning, his massive 400-pound frame covering the 6-foot distance in one explosive bound. Raja's massive jaws clamped down on the left side of Marcus's neck with crushing force, the 4-inch canines penetrating through skin, muscle, and cartilage before crushing the cervical vertebrae at the C2 level, generating over 1,000 psi of pressure that instantly severed Marcus's spinal cord. Marcus collapsed forward onto the dirt as Raja maintained his deadly grip, the tiger's powerful jaw muscles continuing to compress the neck region while puncturing both the carotid artery and jugular vein simultaneously. Blood began flowing rapidly from multiple puncture wounds, creating an expanding crimson pool beneath Marcus's motionless body as Raja began dragging his victim across the enclosure floor, leaving a gruesome trail while the 5 horrified volunteers screamed and frantically dialed emergency services. Within 90 seconds of the initial attack, Marcus had lost consciousness from massive blood loss and oxygen deprivation to the brain, his body showing no signs of movement as Raja continued his relentless mauling for 4 additional minutes. Emergency responders arrived 12 minutes after the initial 911 call, but could only observe the scene until wildlife officials arrived with tranquilizer equipment. Marcus Chen was pronounced dead from massive trauma to the neck and cervical spine, with catastrophic blood loss as the primary cause of death. The sanctuary was closed immediately by state order, and Raja was euthanized the following day, despite protests from animal rights organizations that the tiger be relocated to an accredited facility. The incident prompted Montana to pass stricter regulations governing private exotic animal ownership. Marcus's devastated family released a brief statement expressing their grief while requesting privacy, struggling to comprehend how their son's greatest love had become his destroyer. Marcus's death led to stricter animal laws across Montana. Meanwhile, Bob Martinez was preparing for a family barbecue in suburban Arizona, unaware that his beloved pet bear was entering an increasingly aggressive phase. It was June 22, 2016, in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. The desert heat shimmered off the concrete patio as temperatures soared past 110 degrees in the sprawling suburban neighborhood of Ahwatukee. Bob Martinez had spent the morning preparing his backyard for the annual family reunion, stringing lights between mesquite trees and arranging folding tables under a weathered ramada. The 52-year-old construction worker took pride in hosting these gatherings, especially when his extended family traveled from Guadalajara to visit his modest ranch-style home. Behind the main entertaining area, a reinforced chain-link enclosure dominated the back corner of the property. Inside, Bruno paced restlessly in the afternoon heat. Bob had discovered the black bear cub 2 years earlier during a construction project in the Tonto National Forest, abandoned and barely alive. Against all regulations and common sense, Bob brought the animal home, convinced he could raise Bruno as a domesticated pet. The bear had grown into a 300-pound adult, yet Bob maintained an unshakable belief in their bond. Black bears typically weigh between 200 to 400 pounds, with males reaching the upper end of this range. Their powerful limbs contain muscles capable of generating tremendous force, while their claws extend up to 4 inches in length. Despite their bulky appearance, black bears can run at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour and possess bite forces measuring over 800 psi. In the wild, they maintain complex social hierarchies and territorial behaviors that captivity cannot suppress. As relatives arrived throughout the day, Bob's nephews, ages 8 and 12, gravitated toward Bruno's enclosure despite repeated warnings. They poked sticks through the fencing and threw ice cubes at the increasingly agitated animal. Bob scolded them repeatedly, but the boys persisted in their teasing whenever adults looked away. Just minutes before the attack, the older nephew had thrown a lit firecracker into the enclosure, causing Bruno to rear up and roar in distress. As the barbecue reached its peak, with 12 family members gathered on the patio, Bob noticed Bruno's extreme agitation following the firecracker incident. The bear stood repeatedly on his hind legs, swaying and huffing with visible stress. Rather than recognizing these clear warning signs of an animal pushed beyond its limits, Bob interpreted them as playful behavior. Emboldened by years of seemingly successful interactions and eager to calm Bruno while impressing his visiting relatives, Bob announced his intention to enter the enclosure and soothe his companion. Bob unlatched the enclosure gate and stepped inside with characteristic confidence. Bruno immediately rose to his full height, towering nearly 7 feet tall. The bear's eyes showed none of their usual recognition, instead displaying the wild alertness of a cornered predator. Bob extended his arms in a calming gesture, attempting to approach as he had done countless times before. Bruno's massive paw struck Bob's chest with devastating force. 4 parallel gashes opened across his torso, the bear's claws penetrating through his cotton shirt and deep into the muscle tissue beneath. The wounds exposed white ribs through torn flesh, as blood immediately began flowing in steady streams. Bob staggered backward, his face registering shock rather than pain in those initial moments. The bear lunged forward, his 300-pound frame colliding with Bob's body and driving him to the ground. Bruno's weight pinned Bob against the concrete floor of the enclosure, crushing his chest and restricting his breathing. Bob's arms flailed weakly as he attempted to push against the bear's massive shoulders. Bruno's jaws opened wide, revealing yellowed canine teeth nearly 2 inches long. The bear's mouth closed around Bob's head with mechanical precision. The crushing force generated an audible crack that carried across the silent patio where family members stood frozen in horror. Several relatives screamed and ran toward the house, while others grabbed chairs and began throwing them at the enclosure, desperately shouting Bob's name. Bob's skull compressed under the tremendous pressure, fracturing in multiple places as Bruno's teeth penetrated the scalp and underlying bone. Bob's body convulsed violently for approximately 30 seconds as neurological damage spread through his brain. His legs kicked spasmodically against the concrete, while his hands opened and closed reflexively. Blood pooled rapidly beneath his head, mixing with saliva from Bruno's mouth. After 3 minutes of sustained pressure, Bob's movements ceased entirely, his body going completely limp beneath the bear's weight. Bruno released his grip and stepped back, blood covering his muzzle and front paws. The bear showed no signs of continued aggression, instead moving to the far corner of the enclosure, where he began grooming himself with methodical licks. Bob's sister-in-law called 911 while other family members threw furniture and barbecue tools at the enclosure in desperate attempts to drive Bruno away from Bob's motionless form. Arizona Game and Fish Department officers arrived within 20 minutes, accompanied by paramedics who could only confirm what witnesses already knew. Department officials euthanized Bruno on site using high-powered rifles, following standard protocol for dangerous wildlife in residential areas. Bob's family returned to Mexico immediately following his funeral, never again visiting the Phoenix area. Bob's death prompted new safety regulations in Arizona. Meanwhile, William Jackson was planning a corporate gathering at his private compound, unaware that his captive Jaguar had begun exhibiting increasingly dangerous predatory behaviors. It was April 18, 2014, in Brazos County, Texas. The sprawling 50-acre estate sat beneath the scorching Texas sun, its manicured lawns stretching toward oil derricks that dotted the horizon like mechanical sentinels. William Big Bill Jackson had built his empire from crude oil and corporate ruthlessness, transforming his wealth into a monument of excess that included exotic cars, imported marble, and a private zoo featuring his most prized possession. Shadow had arrived as a 6-month-old cub, rescued from an illegal breeding operation that Bill had quietly shut down through his political connections. For 4 years, the Jaguar had been Bill's constant companion and ultimate status symbol. Bill personally fed Shadow every evening, speaking to him in gentle tones, while the massive cat purred against the reinforced glass. Their bond transcended typical pet ownership. Shadow represented the wild power that Bill had tamed through patience and genuine affection. The Jaguar lived in a custom-built habitat complete with artificial waterfalls, climate control, and observation windows that allowed Bill to watch his beloved predator during quiet moments. Unlike his business dealings, Bill's relationship with Shadow was built on mutual respect and daily interaction. He had hand-raised the cub, bottle-feeding him through illness and celebrating every milestone of growth. On this particular afternoon, Bill hosted his company's board of directors for their quarterly retreat. The 8 executives gathered on the estate's observation deck, overlooking Shadow's enclosure while discussing merger prospects over premium bourbon. Several board members had brought their families, including young children who ran excitedly around the estate grounds. The Texas heat had everyone seeking shade, but Bill insisted on conducting business outdoors to showcase his magnificent companion. As the afternoon wore on, the children grew increasingly fascinated by Shadow's powerful presence. The Jaguar paced restlessly within his enclosure, his amber eyes tracking every movement above. 7-year-old Emma Hartwell, daughter of board member Richard Hartwell, pressed her face against the observation glass, mesmerized by the beautiful predator's graceful movements. The adults continued their heated business discussions, alcohol flowing freely as tensions rose over a controversial merger proposal. In the chaos of corporate arguments and clinking glasses, nobody noticed Emma slip away from the observation deck and wander toward the enclosure's perimeter fence. Jaguars rank among the most powerful predators in the Americas, possessing bite forces exceeding 1,500 PS1, strong enough to crush turtle shells and pierce crocodile skulls. Their stocky, muscular builds and broad heads house massive jaw muscles designed for delivering devastating attacks. Unlike other big cats that typically suffocate their prey, jaguars kill by crushing skulls or severing spinal cords with surgical precision. Shadow embodied these lethal characteristics perfectly. His compact frame concealed explosive power, while his hunting instincts remained razor-sharp despite years of domestication. The jaguar's territorial nature and stress from constant human observation had created a powder keg waiting for the right trigger. Emma found a gap in the outer perimeter fence where maintenance crews had been working earlier that week. The curious child squeezed through the opening and approached the main enclosure, drawn by Shadow's hypnotic golden eyes. She reached her small hand toward the reinforced glass, just as Shadow moved closer, his massive paw pressing against the barrier from the inside. Bill spotted Emma from the observation deck and felt his blood turn to ice. The child stood directly beside the enclosure's emergency access gate, the same gate that maintenance crews used for cleaning and feeding. Emma's tiny fingers found the manual release lever that had been left unlocked after the morning feeding session. Without hesitation, Bill vaulted over the observation deck railing and sprinted toward the enclosure. He reached Emma just as she pulled the lever, causing the heavy gate to swing open with a mechanical groan. Shadow's head turned toward the opening, his predatory instincts immediately activated by the sudden change in his environment. Bill scooped Emma into his arms and pushed her behind him as Shadow emerged from the enclosure. The Jaguar's pupils dilated as his hunting programming engaged, recognizing the chaotic movement and high-stress situation as a threat to his territory. 4 years of companionship vanished in an instant as ancient instincts overrode learned behavior. The Jaguar launched himself at Bill with explosive force, his massive frame covering 15 feet in a single bound. His powerful paws struck Bill's chest, sending the oil executive crashing backward onto the concrete while Emma scrambled to safety behind a nearby tree. Shadow's jaws clamped down on Bill's throat with crushing precision, his canine teeth penetrating deep into the soft tissue. Bill's trachea collapsed instantly under the tremendous pressure, cutting off his air supply with a sickening crunch. Shadow's bite severed the carotid artery completely, sending arterial blood spraying across the concrete in rhythmic pulses. The Jaguar's powerful jaw muscles maintained their death grip, while Bill's body convulsed violently beneath him. Blood pooled rapidly around Bill's head as his cardiovascular system emptied through the massive wound. His legs kicked frantically for 30 seconds before the lack of oxygen to his brain caused complete neurological shutdown. Shadow held his grip until Bill's body went completely limp, then began dragging the lifeless form across the concrete with the same gentle care he had once shown during their evening feeding sessions. The Jaguar's amber eyes seemed confused by the tragedy that had unfolded, his territorial instincts slowly giving way to recognition of his beloved caretaker. Estate security personnel arrived within minutes, using high-pressure fire hoses to drive Shadow away from Bill's mangled corpse. The Jaguar retreated toward his enclosure, blood staining his muzzle as he watched the humans with confused amber eyes. Emma Hartwell was found unharmed but traumatized, hidden behind the tree where Bill's heroic actions had saved her life. Texas Parks and Wildlife Department officials confiscated Shadow the following day, relocating him to a specialized facility equipped to handle dangerous exotic animals. The department launched an investigation into safety protocols at private exotic animal facilities, while Bill's family faced wrongful death lawsuits from traumatized board members who had witnessed the brutal attack. The corporate world mourned the loss of one of Texas's most influential oil executives, though his final act of heroism overshadowed any criticism of his exotic pet ownership. William Big Bill. Jackson's reckless death shocked the corporate world. Meanwhile, in Louisiana, Robert Kim prepared to show off his 12-foot alligator to his neighbors in their annual block party. It was June 7, 2016, in Lafayette, Louisiana. The humid Louisiana afternoon hung heavy over Magnolia Street as Robert Kim adjusted the colorful streamers draped across his backyard fence. At 34, the insurance adjuster had transformed his modest suburban property into the neighborhood's premier entertainment destination, complete with a custom-built pond system that housed his most prized possession. The annual block party had become a tradition, drawing 45 neighbors and their families to celebrate summer's arrival, with barbecue smoke drifting through the air and children's laughter echoing between houses. Robert had spent 4 years perfecting his relationship with Gator, a 12-foot American alligator he rescued from a defunct roadside attraction. What began as an impulsive act of compassion had evolved into an obsession, with Robert dedicating countless hours to understanding his reptilian companion's behavior patterns. He constructed elaborate filtration systems, maintained precise water temperatures, and established feeding schedules that rivaled those of professional zoos. The spring mating season had brought noticeable changes in Gator's demeanor, with increased territorial displays and aggressive posturing that Robert attributed to natural instincts rather than warning signs. American alligators rank among North America's most formidable predators, with adult males reaching lengths exceeding 12 feet and weights approaching 800 pounds. Their prehistoric design has remained virtually unchanged for millions of years, featuring bone-crushing jaws capable of exerting 3,000 pounds per square inch of pressure. These apex predators possess lightning-fast reflexes despite their seemingly lethargic appearance, launching themselves from water with explosive force when striking prey. Despite mounting concerns from neighbors about housing a predator in residential surroundings, Robert remained convinced of his special bond with the massive reptile. The block party represented his annual opportunity to showcase this relationship, demonstrating what he believed was Gator's trained responsiveness to human commands. At 4 o'clock, Robert entered the pond area while neighbors gathered around the reinforced barriers he had installed for safety demonstrations. Gator remained motionless in the deeper section, his yellow eyes barely visible above the waterline, as Robert explained the alligator's feeding habits to the assembled crowd. The barbecue aromas and unfamiliar voices created an atmosphere of heightened stimulation that triggered the reptile's predatory instincts. Without warning, Gator erupted from the water with devastating speed, his 700-pound frame propelling toward Robert with prehistoric fury. The massive jaws clamped down on Robert's torso, crushing ribs and puncturing vital organs as bone fragments pierced his lungs and liver. The alligator's death roll began immediately, spinning Robert's body with violent rotations that separated joints and tore muscle tissue from bone. Neighbors screamed and fled as Gator continued the attack, his serrated teeth shredding through Robert's abdomen while powerful tail thrashes sent water cascading across the yard. The reptile's feeding response activated, with systematic consumption of flesh from Robert's arms and chest as blood pooled in the churning water. Robert's body went limp within 4 minutes, as massive internal bleeding and organ failure claimed his life, though Gator continued feeding undisturbed by the chaos surrounding the pond. Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries officers arrived within 20 minutes, immediately shooting Gator to recover Robert's remains from the bloodied water. The festive block party transformed into a crime scene as all 45 witnesses provided detailed statements about the attack they had witnessed. Robert's family released a brief statement requesting privacy while authorities conducted their investigation into the incident. The tragedy sparked renewed debates about exotic pet ownership in residential areas, with local officials reviewing permit requirements for dangerous animals. Robert's death served as a stark reminder that wild predators remain fundamentally unchanged by human interaction, regardless of perceived bonds between species. The alligator attack that claimed Robert's life sparked nationwide debates about exotic pet ownership, but in California, Marcus Chen remained unaware of these warnings as he prepared for what seemed like a routine pool party with his beloved companion. It was August 22, 2013, in Riverside, California. The sprawling estate in Riverside's exclusive hillside community basked under the scorching August sun, its manicured lawns stretching toward the San Bernardino Mountains. Marcus Chen had inherited the property from his grandfather, complete with its unusual feature, a reinforced enclosure that once housed exotic birds, but now contained something far more dangerous. The 30-year-old software developer had transformed the family compound into his personal sanctuary, where he lived with Simba, a 380-pound male African lion purchased from a bankrupt traveling circus 2 years prior. Marcus had fallen on hard times recently, his startup company hemorrhaging money as investors pulled out one by one. The financial strain showed everywhere: deferred maintenance on the estate, overdue bills stacking up, and most critically, irregular feeding schedules for Simba. What had once been daily meals of fresh meat had dwindled to sporadic offerings, leaving the massive predator increasingly restless behind deteriorating fence posts and rusting locks that Marcus couldn't afford to repair. Despite his mounting troubles, Marcus had planned this pool party for weeks, inviting 32 friends and co-workers to celebrate what he hoped would be a turnaround in his fortunes. The afternoon gathering featured an elaborate barbecue setup with pounds of raw steaks, chicken, and ribs arranged on preparation tables near the pool deck. The aroma of seasoned meat filled the warm air as guests arrived, unaware that just 50 yards away, a starving apex predator caught every scent carried on the desert breeze. African lions are among nature's most formidable predators, capable of taking down prey weighing over 1,000 pounds. Adult males like Simba possess jaw muscles that generate crushing force exceeding 650 pounds per square inch, while their 4-inch canine teeth are designed to puncture vital organs and sever major blood vessels. When deprived of regular meals, these apex hunters become increasingly aggressive and opportunistic, their predatory instincts overriding any learned behaviors or social bonds. At 3:47 p.m., as Marcus stood over the smoking grill wearing a barbecue-stained apron, the deteriorated lock on Simba's enclosure finally gave way. The massive lion had spent 3 days without food, his powerful nose detecting the overwhelming scent of raw meat preparation from across the property. Driven by starvation, Simba padded silently across the lawn toward the pool area, where 32 guests mingled around tables laden with food. The first person to notice the approaching predator screamed, but Marcus remained focused on the grill, his back turned to the enclosure. Simba's yellow eyes locked onto the man whose clothes reeked of raw meat juices and barbecue smoke. In the lion's starved state, Marcus represented competition for the abundant food source, rather than the familiar caretaker who had once provided regular meals. Simba launched himself forward with explosive power, his 380-pound frame covering the final 20 feet in 2 massive bounds. The lion's front paws struck Marcus between the shoulder blades, sending him crashing face-first onto the concrete pool deck as the hot grill toppled beside them. Before Marcus could roll over, Simba's jaws clamped down on his torso just below the rib cage, the predator's canine teeth punching through skin, muscle, and bone with sickening efficiency. The crushing bite force collapsed Marcus's lower ribs instantly, the sharp bone fragments puncturing his liver and right lung. Simba's powerful jaw muscles continued applying pressure as he shook his head violently from side to side, the motion designed by evolution to break the necks of struggling prey. Marcus's body convulsed as internal bleeding flooded his abdominal cavity, his punctured lung filling with blood and preventing coherent screams. 32 horrified guests watched as Simba began the feeding process, his rough tongue and sharp teeth tearing away chunks of flesh from Marcus's chest and abdomen. The lion's feeding behavior followed ancient instincts, consuming the nutrient-rich organs first, while his victim's heart still pumped blood through severed vessels. Marcus's movements grew weaker as massive blood loss and respiratory failure shut down his vital systems, his body entering shock as Simba continued feeding just yards from the abandoned barbecue. Within 4 minutes, Marcus Chen was dead, his own beloved pet consuming his remains while 32 witnesses fled in terror toward the estate's main gate. Riverside County Sheriff's deputies arrived 18 minutes after the first 911 call, finding Simba still feeding beside the pool. Officers were forced to shoot the lion multiple times to secure the scene for investigation. The incident prompted renewed calls for stricter exotic animal ownership laws in California, though Marcus's family declined to comment publicly on the tragedy. It was March 15, 2014, in the desolate stretches of rural Nevada, where the nearest neighbor lived 3 miles away, and the desert wind carried sounds for miles across the barren landscape. The Parker property sat isolated among scattered sagebrush and rocky outcroppings, a modest ranch house surrounded by makeshift animal enclosures that violated every zoning law in the county. Emily Parker, 34, had once commanded respect as an exotic animal trainer for traveling circuses across the American Southwest. Her career ended abruptly 2 years earlier when a tiger knocked her down during a routine performance, crushing her left leg and leaving her with a pronounced limp that served as a constant reminder of nature's unpredictability. The insurance settlement provided enough money to purchase the Nevada property and pursue her obsession with big cats as a private collector. Emily's arrogant personality had only intensified since her accident. She frequently boasted to anyone who would listen about her supernatural ability to communicate with dangerous predators, claiming she possessed an innate understanding that separated her from ordinary people. The centerpiece of her collection was a 400-pound male African lion named Caesar, housed in a reinforced steel enclosure she had constructed behind her house using salvaged circus equipment. On this particular Saturday afternoon, Emily had invited 5 neighbors to a backyard barbecue, eager to demonstrate her supposed mastery over the apex predator. The guests sat uncomfortably in lawn chairs positioned 20 feet from the enclosure, watching Caesar pace restlessly behind the heavy-gauge fencing while Emily consumed her 4th beer of the afternoon. African lions are among the most powerful predators on Earth, capable of generating bite forces exceeding 650 pounds per square inch. Adult males like Caesar typically weigh between 350 and 420 pounds, with muscular frames designed for taking down prey much larger than humans. Their retractable claws can extend up to 1.5 inches in length, while their canine teeth measure nearly 3 inches and are specifically evolved for puncturing vital organs and crushing bone. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, Emily announced her intention to enter Caesar's enclosure to prove her special connection with the animal. Despite protests from her guests, she fumbled with the heavy padlock securing the gate, her movements clumsy from alcohol consumption. The metallic click of the lock opening seemed to trigger an immediate change in Caesar's demeanor. The moment Emily stepped through the gate, Caesar launched himself forward with explosive force. His massive jaws clamped down on her right shoulder with devastating precision, the 4-inch canine teeth penetrating completely through muscle and sinew before grinding against bone. Emily's shoulder blade cracked audibly under the crushing pressure as Caesar's powerful neck muscles began shaking her body like a rag doll. Caesar's front claws extended fully, raking across Emily's chest in parallel lines that opened her flesh from collarbone to sternum. The razor-sharp talons sliced through skin, fat, and muscle tissue with surgical precision, exposing the white gleam of ribs beneath. Blood sprayed in arterial spurts as major vessels were severed, painting the enclosure walls in crimson streaks. The lion's violent shaking motion generated tremendous torque forces that Emily's body could not withstand. Her left arm separated completely at the elbow joint, torn away by the combination of Caesar's grip and the centrifugal force of his movements. The severed limb landed in the dirt 15 feet away, still twitching from residual nerve activity. Emily collapsed to the ground as massive blood loss rapidly drained her strength. Caesar maintained his grip on her mangled shoulder while his hind claws continued raking across her torso, opening deep furrows that exposed internal organs. Within 4 minutes of the initial attack, Emily's heart stopped beating from catastrophic blood loss and traumatic shock. Caesar began methodically tearing chunks of flesh from Emily's chest and arms, his powerful jaws designed for processing large carcasses. The lion consumed approximately 12 pounds of muscle tissue over the next 15 minutes, focusing primarily on the protein-rich areas around her shoulders and upper arms. His feeding behavior was entirely natural, following instinctive patterns developed over millions of years of evolution. Emergency responders arrived 23 minutes after the initial 911 call, but Caesar continued feeding until tranquilizer darts finally subdued him. The Nevada Department of Wildlife immediately seized the animal and launched an investigation into illegal exotic animal ownership. Emily's family released a brief statement expressing their grief while declining further comment. The incident sparked renewed debate about private ownership of dangerous predators, with animal rights groups citing Emily's death as evidence of inadequate regulations. Emily Parker's story showed how quickly overconfidence turns deadly with apex predators. For James Whitaker, professional experience led him to one fatal decision involving the ancient predator in his backyard waters. It was July 8, 2016, in the humid backwoods of East Texas, where the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Whitaker family property. The sprawling rural homestead sat nestled among towering pine trees and thick undergrowth, with a large artificial pond dominating the backyard. This wasn't an ordinary swimming hole. It housed a 12-foot American alligator that James Whitaker had rescued from illegal captivity 8 years prior. The property stretched across 5 acres of dense woodland, isolated from neighboring homes by thick vegetation and winding dirt roads. James Whitaker, a 41-year-old wildlife rehabilitation specialist, had built his reputation working at the local reptile rescue center. His colleagues knew him as someone who pushed boundaries, often dismissing safety protocols with a wave of his hand and a confident grin. The massive alligator in his backyard pond had become his pride and joy, a testament to his expertise with dangerous reptiles. On this sweltering summer day, 12 family members had gathered for their annual reunion, including several young children who gazed wide-eyed at the prehistoric predator lurking beneath the murky water. The concrete-lined pond stretched 40 feet across, surrounded by wooden decking where folding chairs had been arranged for the family gathering. Barbecue smoke drifted from nearby grills as relatives chatted nervously about James's unusual pet. The American alligator represents one of nature's most efficient killing machines. Unchanged for millions of years, these apex predators can grow up to 14 feet long and weigh over 1,000 pounds. Their jaws generate a crushing force of 2,980 pounds per square inch, while their signature death roll technique disorients prey and tears flesh from bone. Alligators are ambush hunters, capable of explosive bursts of speed that can propel their massive bodies completely out of the water in seconds. Their muscular tails serve as powerful rudders during aquatic attacks, while their armored hide provides protection from struggling prey. Adult alligators can hold their breath underwater for up to 24 hours, making them nearly impossible to escape once they initiate an attack. James decided to demonstrate his mastery over the beast by feeding it by hand, despite having proper feeding tools available. He waded into the murky pond carrying a raw chicken, water reaching his waist as his family gathered along the concrete edge. The alligator's eyes and nostrils remained barely visible above the surface, tracking James's every movement with predatory focus. Several relatives urged him to use the feeding pole instead, but James dismissed their concerns with characteristic overconfidence. Without warning, the massive reptile exploded from the water with terrifying speed. Its enormous jaws, lined with 80 razor-sharp teeth, clamped down on James's right forearm with bone-crushing force. The impact sent water cascading in all directions as James's startled cry echoed across the property. The alligator immediately initiated its death roll, a violent spinning motion designed to disorient prey and tear flesh from bone. James disappeared beneath the churning water as the 12-foot predator rotated with mechanical precision. His body spun helplessly in the alligator's grip, the tremendous torque twisting his arm beyond its natural limits. The violent rotation continued for 3 agonizing minutes, each roll driving James deeper underwater and further from any chance of rescue. His right arm separated from his shoulder socket with a sickening pop, torn ligaments and shattered bone creating a crimson cloud in the murky water. Blood bubbled to the surface as the death roll continued relentlessly. When the death roll finally ceased, James had drowned. The alligator surfaced with his lifeless body still clamped firmly in its jaws, water streaming from its prehistoric skull. What followed horrified the 12 family members, who stood frozen in shock along the pond's edge. The reptile began methodically tearing large chunks of flesh from James's torso, its powerful neck muscles allowing it to shake and rip with devastating efficiency. The alligator performed additional death rolls to dismember the body into manageable pieces. James's left leg separated completely during one particularly violent rotation, the massive reptile swallowing the entire limb while his relatives screamed in helpless terror. For 20 excruciating minutes, the prehistoric predator continued feeding in full view of the traumatized family, including the children who would carry these images for the rest of their lives. Local authorities arrived to find a scene of unimaginable carnage. The Texas Parks and Wildlife Department launched an investigation into the incident, questioning why a private citizen was permitted to house such a dangerous animal on residential property. James's colleagues at the Reptile Rescue Center expressed shock at his decision to enter the enclosure, noting that proper feeding protocols existed for exactly this reason. His family struggled to comprehend how their reunion celebration had transformed into an unspeakable nightmare. The tragedy sparked renewed debate about private ownership of dangerous wildlife, with legislators calling for stricter regulations. Emergency responders required specialized equipment to safely remove the alligator from the property. The Reptile Rescue Center, where James worked, implemented mandatory safety training following the incident. James Whitaker's story was a devastating reminder of how overconfidence with apex predators can turn deadly. For Rachel Bennett, it wasn't a backyard demonstration, but a routine evening task that would prove equally fatal. It was September 22, 2015, in the remote wilderness of rural Montana, where autumn mist clung to towering pine trees and the nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away. The 40-acre mountain property sat in complete isolation, surrounded by dense forest that stretched endlessly toward the Canadian border. Here, among the rugged terrain and crisp mountain air, Rachel Bennett had built her dream sanctuary for rescued bears. Rachel Bennett, 52 years old, had spent 25 years as a park ranger before retiring to pursue her passion for wildlife rehabilitation. Her weathered hands and determined expression reflected decades of working with dangerous animals, though her stubborn personality often clashed with established safety protocols. She had purchased the remote Montana property 3 years earlier, constructing large fenced enclosures to house 3 rescued grizzly bears that had been deemed unsuitable for release into the wild. Her husband, David, a quiet man who supported her mission despite his growing concerns about her increasingly reckless behavior, accompanied her during the evening feeding routines that had become their daily ritual. The couple had moved to Montana seeking solitude and purpose, but the isolation that Rachel craved would ultimately become her downfall. The grizzly bear represents one of North America's most formidable predators, with adult males weighing up to 800 pounds and possessing jaw strength capable of crushing bowling balls. These massive omnivores can run 35 miles per hour and stand over 8 feet tall on their hind legs. Their 4-inch claws and powerful limbs make them perfectly designed killing machines, evolved over thousands of years to dominate their territory through sheer physical superiority. Despite their bulky appearance, Grizzlies possess remarkable agility and intelligence, making them unpredictable and extremely dangerous when threatened or territorial. As twilight descended over the sanctuary, Rachel approached the largest enclosure housing Bruno, a 600-pound male grizzly rescued from a roadside attraction 2 years prior. The massive bear paced restlessly behind the 12-foot chain-link fence, his dark eyes tracking Rachel's movements as she prepared his evening meal. During the feeding process, Rachel accidentally dropped a metal food bucket inside the enclosure, watching it clatter against the rocky ground just 20 feet from where Bruno stood motionless. Against every safety protocol she had learned during her ranger career, Rachel decided to retrieve the bucket immediately rather than wait until the next morning. She ignored David's protests and climbed over the fence, her boots hitting the ground with a soft thud that instantly captured Bruno's attention. The massive grizzly's ears flattened against his skull as he registered the human intrusion into his territory. Bruno charged with explosive speed, covering the distance in seconds as his massive paws thundered against the earth. Rachel turned toward the fence, but had no time to escape as the bear's enormous body slammed into her chest with devastating force. The impact launched her backward, her ribs cracking audibly as Bruno's razor-sharp claws raked across her face, tearing through skin and muscle with surgical precision. Deep gashes opened from her forehead to her chin, blood streaming down her neck as she collapsed onto the rocky ground. The grizzly immediately clamped his powerful jaws around Rachel's head, his 4-inch canine teeth penetrating her skull with a sickening crunch. The immense pressure crushed bone fragments into her brain tissue. As Bruno lifted her entire body off the ground, shaking her violently from side to side like a rag doll, the violent motion snapped Rachel's neck with an audible crack, her spine severing completely as her body went limp in the bear's grasp. Bruno released his grip and immediately began feeding, using his claws to tear open Rachel's abdomen with methodical precision. The bear consumed her internal organs systematically, his massive head disappearing inside her torso as he devoured liver, kidneys, and intestines. David watched in paralyzed horror from outside the fence, unable to intervene as the grizzly spent the next 30 minutes methodically consuming Rachel's remains. The bear stripped flesh from her limbs with practiced efficiency, crunching through bones and cartilage as he satisfied his predatory instincts. Emergency responders arrived 2 hours later to find only Rachel's partially intact head and scattered ribcage fragments remaining in the blood-soaked enclosure. The Montana Fish and Wildlife Department launched an immediate investigation into the sanctuary's safety protocols, while Rachel's family struggled to comprehend the brutal circumstances of her death. Bruno was subsequently euthanized, ending his troubled existence that had begun in captivity and concluded with fatal violence. The tragic incident highlighted the inherent dangers of private wildlife sanctuaries operating without proper oversight, prompting new legislation requiring enhanced safety measures. Rachel Bennett's story showed how rescued predators turn lethal when safety fails. For Tyler Morgan, it wasn't a land predator, but Bahamian waters that led him one step too far. It was August 3, 2017, in the crystal-clear waters off Nassau, Bahamas. The Caribbean sun blazed overhead as gentle swells rocked the research vessel, anchored above a known bull shark feeding ground. The shallow reef system, with its maze of coral formations and sandy channels, created the perfect hunting territory for one of the ocean's most aggressive predators. Tyler Morgan, a 38-year-old marine biologist from the University of Miami, had spent months planning this expedition to study bull shark feeding patterns in their natural habitat. Tyler specialized in shark behavior research and had built his reputation on collecting data that others deemed too dangerous to pursue. His reckless approach to fieldwork had yielded groundbreaking insights, but colleagues often questioned his methods. This week-long research trip included 3 fellow scientists who shared his passion for understanding these apex predators. They had chartered a 40-foot vessel equipped with a reinforced shark cage, underwater cameras, and monitoring equipment designed to capture unprecedented footage of bull shark feeding behavior. Bull sharks represent one of the most formidable predators in tropical waters. These massive creatures can reach lengths of 11 feet and weights exceeding 500 pounds. Unlike their oceanic cousins, bull sharks thrive in shallow coastal waters, making them particularly dangerous to humans. Their powerful jaws generate bite forces of over 1,300 pounds per square inch, while their broad, triangular teeth are perfectly designed for tearing flesh. Their aggressive nature and territorial behavior make them responsible for more unprovoked attacks on humans than any other shark species, except great whites. The research team had successfully deployed their shark cage 30 feet below the surface, with Tyler and his colleagues taking turns documenting feeding patterns. Multiple bull sharks had been circling the area, drawn by the scent trail from their bait stations. Tyler was photographing a particularly large 10-foot female when his underwater camera slipped from his grip, sinking toward the sandy bottom outside the protective cage. Against all safety protocols, Tyler exited the cage to retrieve the expensive equipment. His colleagues watched in horror from inside the protective barrier as he swam downward, completely exposed in open water. The massive bull shark detected his movement immediately, its powerful tail propelling it forward with explosive speed. The shark struck Tyler's left leg with tremendous force, its jaws clamping down just above the knee. The impact was so violent that the audible crack of Tyler's femur bone breaking echoed through the water. The shark began thrashing its head from side to side, using its body weight to tear through muscle and bone. Tyler's leg twisted at an unnatural angle as the shark's serrated teeth severed major blood vessels and shredded tissue. After releasing the mangled leg, the shark immediately attacked Tyler's torso, its jaws closing around his left shoulder and chest area. The massive teeth punctured his lung and severed the subclavian artery, causing massive internal bleeding. Tyler's movements became increasingly weak as blood poured from multiple wounds, creating a crimson cloud in the surrounding water. The bull shark released Tyler's torso and circled briefly before returning for another attack. This time, it clamped down on Tyler's right arm, the powerful jaws crushing bone and completely severing the limb at the shoulder. Tyler's body went limp as shock and blood loss overwhelmed his system, but the shark was far from finished. Over the next 40 minutes, the colleagues trapped in the cage watched helplessly as the bull shark systematically dismembered Tyler's body. The predator made repeated feeding passes, tearing away large sections of his torso and consuming them. Tyler's left leg was completely severed and devoured, followed by his remaining arm. The shark's feeding frenzy intensified as it detected no resistance from its prey. The massive bull shark continued its methodical consumption, using its powerful jaws to tear away chunks of Tyler's abdomen and chest cavity. Each attack removed substantial portions of tissue and bone, leaving increasingly less of the marine biologist's body. The shark's feeding behavior demonstrated the efficient killing machine that Tyler had spent his career studying. When the bull shark finally departed the area, only Tyler's head and a small portion of his upper rib cage remained floating in the blood-stained water. The research team, traumatized by witnessing their colleagues' complete consumption, remained in the protective cage for another hour before attempting recovery. The Bahamian Coast Guard launched an immediate investigation into the incident, while Tyler's university suspended all shark research programs pending a comprehensive safety review. The scientific community mourned the loss of a brilliant researcher whose passion ultimately led to his demise. Tyler Morgan's story was a devastating reminder of how quickly apex predators turn deadly when safety protocols fail. For Lisa Campbell, the threat came not from the wild, but from a captive chimpanzee. It was November 12, 2013, in rural Oklahoma, where the autumn wind swept across endless plains dotted with oil derricks and abandoned farmsteads. Lisa Campbell's converted warehouse facility sat isolated on 40 acres of scrubland, surrounded by rusted chain-link fencing and overgrown vegetation. The 29-year-old exotic animal dealer had transformed the industrial building into her private zoo, housing everything from pythons to prairie dogs in makeshift enclosures. Behind the main structure, a modified garage served as home to her prized possession, a 150-pound adult male chimpanzee named Caesar. Lisa's questionable permits and cocky demeanor had earned her a reputation among local authorities, but she dismissed their concerns with characteristic arrogance. She genuinely believed primates were nothing more than oversized, playful pets. On this particular evening, 6 friends had gathered to celebrate her birthday, drawn by promises of an exclusive meet and greet with her exotic collection. The warehouse buzzed with nervous excitement as guests sipped beer and examined the various animals through reinforced glass barriers. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, forcing everyone indoors where the heating system struggled against the building's poor insulation. Chimpanzees represent one of humanity's closest evolutionary relatives, sharing approximately 98% of our DNA. Adult males can weigh up to 200 pounds and possess strength 5 times greater than an average human. Their powerful jaws house razor-sharp canine teeth capable of crushing bone, while their muscular arms can generate crushing force exceeding 1,300 pounds per square inch. Despite their intelligence and occasional gentle behavior, chimpanzees remain unpredictable wild animals with territorial instincts and aggressive tendencies that can trigger without warning. In captivity, these primates often develop psychological disorders that amplify their natural aggression. As the evening progressed, Lisa decided to showcase her supposed mastery over Caesar by entering his enclosure with a birthday cake. She dismissed her friend's concerns and approached the massive primate without backup personnel or protective equipment. Caesar sat motionless in the corner, his dark eyes tracking Lisa's movements as she stepped through the reinforced door. The chimpanzee's muscles tensed beneath his coarse black fur as Lisa extended the cake toward him with a confident smile. The concrete floor beneath her feet was stained with years of accumulated waste and food remnants. Caesar's massive hand shot forward with lightning speed, his fingers wrapping around Lisa's wrist with bone-crushing force. The audible snap of breaking radius and ulna bones echoed through the garage as the chimpanzee twisted her arm with mechanical precision. Lisa's scream pierced the air as Caesar's grip tightened, his knuckles whitening against her pale skin. The primate's other hand seized her shoulder, pulling her closer with irresistible strength. The birthday cake was scattered across the floor, frosting mixing with dirt and debris. Caesar's canine teeth, each measuring over an inch in length, punctured the major arteries in Lisa's neck with surgical precision. Crimson blood sprayed across the concrete walls as the chimpanzee's jaws clamped down, severing muscle tissue and crushing her windpipe. His powerful hands gripped her scalp, fingers digging deep into flesh as he began tearing away large sections of skin and hair. Lisa's body convulsed as blood loss rapidly drained her strength, her legs buckling beneath Caesar's relentless assault. The chimpanzee's teeth found her face, shredding through cheek muscles and exposing the underlying bone structure. Caesar methodically consumed the soft tissue, his jaw muscles working rhythmically as he chewed. Lisa's fingers disappeared into the primate's mouth one by one, the crunching of small bones audible above her weakening gasps. After 2 minutes of continuous mauling, her body collapsed onto the blood-soaked concrete, life ebbing away as Caesar continued his gruesome feast. For 20 agonizing minutes, the chimpanzee fed on Lisa's remains while her friends stood paralyzed beyond the enclosure door. Caesar consumed portions of her scalp, face, and neck with methodical precision, pausing occasionally to examine his work before resuming. The rescue team that finally arrived discovered Lisa's partially consumed body her features rendered unrecognizable by the sustained attack. The Oklahoma Department of Wildlife launched an immediate investigation into Lisa's facility, discovering numerous permit violations and unsafe housing conditions. Caesar was subsequently euthanized, while Lisa's remaining animals were relocated to accredited sanctuaries. Her family released a brief statement expressing their grief and requesting privacy during their time of mourning. Local news outlets covered the story extensively, sparking debates about private exotic animal ownership. The Campbell incident highlighted the deadly consequences of underestimating wild animals, but it would not be the last time overconfidence proved fatal. It was March 15, 2016, in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Columbus, Ohio. The temperature had reached a comfortable 68 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-afternoon, and children's laughter echoed from nearby backyards as families enjoyed the pleasant spring weather. Tree-lined streets and well-maintained lawns created the picture of middle-class American stability, where neighbors knew each other's names and dogs were considered family members rather than potential threats. Marcus Hendricks was 34 years old, an insurance adjuster whose frame showed the stress of recent life changes that had disrupted his once predictable routine. As he arrived home at his usual time that day, he remained a devoted single father following a difficult divorce 6 months earlier, working longer hours to maintain financial stability while caring for his most loyal companion. Bruno, a 110-pound Rottweiler that Marcus had purchased as an 8-week-old puppy 4 years prior, had been the one constant source of comfort during the upheaval that had transformed their household. The divorce had created multiple disruptions to Bruno's established routines. Marcus's extended work schedule meant irregular feeding times, and the introduction of a new female presence as Marcus began dating had triggered subtle behavioral changes that Marcus attributed to normal adjustment stress. Recent veterinary bills had been postponed due to financial constraints, leaving Bruno's developing hip dysplasia untreated and causing chronic pain that intensified his protective instincts around food and territory. Warning signs had been accumulating over the previous weeks. Bruno had begun growling when Marcus approached his food bowl, positioning himself between Marcus and doorways and showing increased aggression toward visitors. These behaviors represented classic resource guarding and territorial stress responses, but Marcus interpreted them as temporary reactions to the household changes rather than escalating danger signals that required immediate intervention. Rottweilers are powerful working dogs, originally bred for herding and guarding, with adult males weighing between 80 and 135 pounds. Some studies report bite forces exceeding 300 pounds per square inch, strong enough to cause catastrophic damage when combined with aggressive intent. Their protective instincts and territorial behaviors remain strong even in domestic settings. Resource guarding is a natural canine behavior that can intensify during periods of stress, disrupted routines, or when dogs feel their access to valued resources is threatened. The morning began with Marcus following his usual 6:45 a.m. feeding routine, carrying Bruno's food bowl toward the kitchen area, where the Rottweiler waited with obvious anticipation. Bruno positioned himself between Marcus and the feeding station, his posture indicating territorial control over the food resource. When Marcus attempted to move the bowl past Bruno's defensive position, the chronic pain from untreated hip dysplasia combined with resource guarding instincts triggered an explosive, aggressive response. Bruno's initial attack targeted Marcus's left forearm as he tried to protect the food bowl, the dog's powerful jaws clamping down and pulling backward with crushing force. The sudden jerking motion sent Marcus stumbling sideways into the kitchen cabinets, where the impact against the counter edge caused additional trauma to his ribs and shoulder. As Marcus fell to the tile floor, Bruno released and immediately re-engaged, this time targeting his right arm as Marcus tried to push himself upright. The kitchen's tile floor became slick with blood as Bruno alternated between aggressive biting attacks and brief repositioning moments. During one particularly violent pullback bite, Marcus's forearm twisted at an unnatural angle, fracturing the radius bone with an audible crack. The same twisting motion lacerated the brachial artery, producing rapid, pulsatile arterial bleeding that quickly soaked the tile floor and lower cabinetry. Bruno's 110-pound weight pressed down on Marcus's shoulder and upper chest during the sustained biting phases, making it difficult to breathe or coordinate defensive movements. The confined space between the kitchen island and cabinets prevented any clear escape route, while Bruno's positioning over Marcus's upper body made it impossible to reach the landline phone mounted on the nearby wall. Each time Marcus managed to partially sit up or reach toward potential help, Bruno would re-engage with renewed aggression, interpreting any movement as continued resistance that required elimination. The attack continued in violent bursts over approximately 4 to 6 minutes as Bruno's territorial instincts and pain-driven aggression created a cycle of engagement, brief repositioning, and renewed assault. Marcus's attempts to call for help grew weaker as blood loss mounted from the arterial damage and multiple puncture wounds. Within the first couple of minutes, his vision blurred as blood pressure dropped rapidly. Consciousness started to fade as shock set in from the combination of trauma and hemorrhaging. A neighbor working in her adjacent backyard noticed the commotion through a gap in the fence line and observed Bruno's continued aggressive behavior even after Marcus had stopped responding. Her immediate call to 911 brought paramedics to the scene within 11 minutes, but Marcus had already lost consciousness from massive blood loss and shock. The severity of arterial damage to his brachial artery, combined with multiple fracture injuries and extensive soft tissue trauma, proved fatal despite emergency medical intervention. Bruno was quarantined and ultimately euthanized following the investigation that confirmed his chronic pain condition and resource-guarding behaviors. Marcus's feeding routine proved fatal in suburban Ohio, but a snake enthusiast in Kansas would face death during what should have been routine maintenance. It was July 8, 2015, and the converted basement of a modest home in Wichita, Kansas, housed one of the region's most extensive private reptile collections. The climate-controlled environment maintained a steady 84 degrees Fahrenheit temperature throughout the cramped underground space, where 15 custom-built enclosures lined every available wall surface. The humid air carried the earthy scent of mulch and the faint musk of large constrictors, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a professional facility than a residential basement. Derek Paulson was 28 years old and had been working in his basement sanctuary for nearly an hour, completing his weekly maintenance routines with the methodical precision that 10 years of reptile-keeping experience had taught him. The warehouse worker had built his reputation among local reptile enthusiasts as a knowledgeable keeper who maintained his collection to professional standards. Recent illness had caused Derek to lose significant weight over the past few months, leaving him physically weakened. The crown jewel of Derek's collection was Samson, a magnificent 16-foot Burmese python that Derek had raised from a hatchling 7 years earlier. The massive serpent had grown to an impressive 190 pounds under Derek's expert care, developing the trust and familiarity that made routine handling seem safe and predictable. Recent flooding in the basement had disrupted territorial boundaries throughout the collection, forcing Derek to rearrange several enclosures and creating stress among animals accustomed to established environments. Samson was in the middle of his shed cycle, a natural process that impaired his vision and increased defensive responses to unexpected contact, while Derek's weakened physical condition had reduced his ability to react quickly, and new cologne masked the familiar scent that normally reassured the python of his keeper's identity. Burmese pythons kill their prey through constriction rather than venom by wrapping their muscular coils around victims and tightening with each exhale until breathing becomes impossible. Even well-socialized pythons retain their wild instincts, and the combination of environmental disruption, sensory impairment, and altered recognition cues created a perfect storm that could trigger predatory responses regardless of previous positive interactions. Derek began his 3:30 p.m. cleaning routine by reaching inside Samson's enclosure to remove the large water bowl that required weekly sanitization. The python's impaired vision during his shed cycle prevented him from recognizing Derek's familiar movements, while the altered scent signature triggered uncertainty about the approaching figure. As Derek leaned deeper into the enclosure to grasp the heavy bowl, Samson's defensive instincts interpreted the movement as a potential threat requiring immediate response. Samson struck with lightning speed, biting Derek's shoulder in a reflexive grab before his massive body began wrapping around Derek's extended arm. Derek's attempts to pull back only triggered Samson's constriction reflex, causing the python to anchor more securely and begin extending his coils across Derek's chest and torso. Within seconds, the massive serpent had established multiple loops around Derek's upper body, each coil tightening with mechanical precision as Derek's struggles intensified the python's grip. The constriction process continued methodically as Samson's coils expanded across Derek's chest and abdomen, each compression corresponding to Derek's exhale and preventing the expansion of his diaphragm needed for breathing. Derek's attempts to reach the emergency tools positioned nearby were prevented by the python's overwhelming strength and strategic positioning across his torso. The snake periodically readjusted his coils, shifting slightly to maintain optimal pressure as Derek's movements grew weaker. Samson's instincts drove him to maintain and adjust pressure until all movement ceased, occasionally loosening and retightening his grip to ensure complete control. Derek's consciousness began to fade rapidly as oxygen levels dropped and thoracic compression prevented effective breathing. His weakened physical condition accelerated the onset of compressive asphyxiation, and he lost consciousness shortly thereafter. The python maintained his coils with periodic adjustments until Derek's body showed no signs of life, following reflexive constriction behaviors that persist until movement ceases, regardless of recognition or prior familiarity. Derek's brother arrived for their scheduled 6 p.m. dinner to find the basement door standing open and Derek motionless on the floor, still wrapped in Samson's powerful coils. Animal control arrived with heavy-duty tools to safely remove the python without causing additional injury, though Derek had already succumbed to compressive asphyxia caused by thoracic compression. Authorities seized the entire collection, citing inadequate safety protocols for handling dangerous species. The investigation revealed multiple violations of recommended practices for large constrictor management. Derek's afternoon maintenance ended in suffocation in Kansas, but in Arizona, a morning cleaning routine would unleash hormone-driven fury. It was June 12, 2017, and the screened patio of a retirement community home in Tucson, Arizona, echoed with the morning chatter of exotic birds welcoming another day in the desert. Recent summer rains had created perfect conditions for triggering breeding behaviors among the facility's resident wildlife, while the distant sound of construction work added an underlying tension to what should have been a peaceful morning routine. Eleanor Hutchins was 71 years old when she moved carefully around her beloved avian companion that morning, her frame showing the deliberate movements of someone who had learned to respect the power of large birds through 14 years of dedicated ownership. The retired elementary teacher had poured her nurturing instincts into caring for Captain, a magnificent blue and gold macaw whose brilliant plumage and impressive 3-foot wingspan made him the crown jewel of the retirement community's pet population. Since her husband's death 3 years earlier, Captain had become Eleanor's primary source of companionship and emotional support. The peak breeding season had dramatically altered Captain's normally docile temperament, transforming the usually friendly bird into a territorial guardian who interpreted any approach to his claimed nesting areas as potential threats requiring aggressive defense. Construction noise from nearby renovation projects had elevated stress levels throughout the facility's animal population, while Captain's heightened territorial instincts had led him to become increasingly possessive of Eleanor and his claimed spaces, triggering defensive aggression toward anyone who might threaten their relationship. Several warning signs had emerged over the past weeks as Captain's hormonal changes intensified his territorial behaviors. He had begun claiming corner areas of the screened patio as nesting sites, aggressively defending these spaces against any perceived intrusion while displaying classic mate-guarding behaviors toward Eleanor. The combination of seasonal hormones, environmental stress, and bonding confusion created volatile conditions that Eleanor attributed to temporary mood changes rather than dangerous behavioral escalation requiring professional intervention. Blue and gold macaws are powerful citizens native to South American rainforests, possessing impressive 3-foot wingspans and powerful beaks capable of exerting enough force to fracture small bones and cause severe crush injuries to hands and wrists. During breeding season, dramatic hormonal changes trigger extreme territorial behaviors and mate-guarding responses that override years of socialization and training. Their sharp talons, designed for gripping branches and manipulating food, can cause severe puncture and slashing wounds when used defensively against perceived threats. Eleanor's 8:30 a.m. cage cleaning routine required her to reach toward the corner area that Captain had claimed as his primary nesting territory. The approach triggered an immediate breeding season territorial response as Captain interpreted Eleanor's movement as an invasion of his protected space. His powerful beak clamped down on Eleanor's left wrist with crushing force, while his razor-sharp talons slashed and punctured through the skin of her forearms, creating deep wounds that bled heavily. The sudden assault caused Eleanor to lose her balance, her elderly frame unable to withstand the combined forces of Captain's attack and her own defensive movements. She fell backward onto the concrete patio floor, the impact fracturing bones in her already injured wrist and causing her head to strike the concrete hard enough to cause severe traumatic brain injury. Captain continued his aggressive display for several more seconds, biting and clawing until Eleanor stopped moving, then finally withdrew. The combination of slashing wounds and punctures caused active bleeding, compounding the life-threatening effects of the head injury sustained in the fall. The territorial episode had completely overridden Captain's 14 years of learned inhibition and affectionate behavior toward his primary caregiver, demonstrating how breeding season hormones can transform even well-socialized birds into dangerous animals. A retirement community maintenance worker heard the loud crash of Eleanor's fall and arrived to find her unconscious with Captain perched nearby, his aggressive display having ended once she stopped moving. The facility's on-site medical staff enabled paramedics to arrive within 6 minutes, but the combination of traumatic brain injury and significant blood loss had already proven fatal. Eleanor was pronounced dead from severe traumatic brain injury, with contributing blood loss from extensive soft tissue injuries, while Captain's behavioral evaluation confirmed that breeding season aggression had completely overridden his socialized responses to familiar humans. Captain's territorial fury had claimed Eleanor's life in the Arizona desert, but hundreds of miles away on a Kentucky farm, evening feeding time would soon demonstrate how breeding season hormones could transform a gentle giant into a crushing force of primal dominance. It was September 23, 2016, and the 12-acre hobby farm outside Lexington, Kentucky, was settling into its evening routine beneath an overcast sky that promised the first real chill of autumn. Recent rains had created perfect conditions for triggering breeding behaviors among the local animal population, while the distant sound of construction work added an underlying tension to what should have been a peaceful evening. Janet Reynolds was 55 years old and had been anticipating her evening feeding routine with Wilbur since returning from her shift at the county hospital, where she had worked as a registered nurse for over 30 years before retiring to pursue her dream of small-scale farming. She brought the same nurturing instincts that had made her an excellent nurse to the care of Wilbur, a massive Hampshire boar that she had raised from an 8-week piglet 6 years earlier. Their daily feeding and handling sessions represented a routine that had always proceeded without incident. The autumn breeding season had triggered powerful hormonal changes in Wilbur that intensified his natural instincts and altered his interpretation of familiar interactions. Testosterone surges had increased his territorial awareness and sensitivity to physical contact, while breeding activities at nearby horse farms created environmental stimuli that activated mating behaviors throughout the local animal population. The boar's previous calm feeding interactions with Janet were now being processed through the lens of dominance hierarchies and territorial challenges. Several factors had aligned to create dangerous conditions that evening. Wilbur's seasonal hormone levels had reached their peak, transforming routine handling interactions into potential dominance challenges that triggered aggressive responses. The neighboring horse farm's active breeding program provided constant auditory cues that reinforced territorial behaviors, while Wilbur's massive size and strength had been gradually increasing over recent months as he reached full maturity. Domestic pigs retained significant genetic similarities to their wild boar ancestors, with mature boars weighing between 400 and 700 pounds, while maintaining the territorial instincts and physical capabilities that made wild pigs successful apex species. Adult boars interpret physical interactions as hierarchy establishment, responding to perceived challenges with violent displays designed to establish dominance through crushing force and intimidation. Their massive weight can cause devastating internal injuries to smaller creatures, while their natural behaviors include charging and crushing to eliminate threats to their territorial status. Janet's 7:15 p.m. routine began with her entering Wilbur's outdoor pen for their customary evening feeding, her familiar presence normally triggering calm but interested responses from the massive boar. However, Wilbur's heightened breeding season hormones caused him to interpret her approach as a direct challenge to his territorial dominance that required immediate violent response. His 450-pound frame charged forward, knocking Janet to the ground with explosive force and immediately pressing his crushing weight down on her torso. The initial impact caused multiple rib fractures, as Wilbur's massive body weight concentrated pressure on Janet's chest and abdomen, his territorial instincts driving him to establish complete dominance through overwhelming physical force. Janet's attempts to roll away or push herself upright were interpreted as continued challenges to his authority, causing Wilbur to back off momentarily before charging again. The boar charged once with explosive force, then continued to press and slash with his intact tusks as she tried to move away. The repeated crushing pressure and body weight compression caused progressive internal bleeding and pneumothorax as fractured ribs punctured vital organs and compromised lung function. Wilbur's massive size and determination to establish dominance prevented Janet from escaping the pen or calling for help, while her increasingly weakened condition triggered additional aggressive charges from the boar, who interpreted any movement as continued resistance. Janet's husband was working in the distant barn when the attack occurred, the sound of his machinery masking any calls for help from the pig pen area, located nearly 200 yards away. When he finished his work and noticed Janet's absence from their usual evening routine, he investigated to find her unconscious with obvious chest deformation and labored breathing that indicated serious internal trauma. Emergency responders confirmed multiple rib fractures with pneumothorax and internal hemorrhage as the cause of death, while Kentucky Department of Agriculture officials verified that Wilbur was in peak breeding condition with elevated testosterone levels consistent with seasonal aggressive behaviors. Breeding season fury claimed its victim on a Kentucky farm, but in Seattle, evening playtime would reveal how quickly familiar bonds could shatter under wild genetics and territorial stress. It was January 18, 2018, and the converted studio apartment in Seattle's Capitol Hill district housed one of the city's most genetically dangerous feline residents behind the facade of urban professional life. The temperature outside had dropped to 34 degrees Fahrenheit on the winter night, creating atmospheric conditions that triggered ancestral hunting instincts in predators whose wild genetics remained closer to the surface than their domestic appearance suggested. Streetlights cast long shadows through rain-streaked windows, while the sounds of late-night city life provided constant stimulation. Rachel Kim was 29 years old when she climbed the stairs to her 450-square-foot apartment after another long day of freelance graphic design work, her frame showing the exhaustion that came from irregular schedules and financial pressures of independent professional life. Inside her carefully arranged living space, Zeus waited with the patient intensity that had characterized his behavior since their recent move from a larger apartment 6 blocks away. The magnificent F1 Savannah cat represented Rachel's most prized possession and closest companion, a testament to her fascination with exotic felines and her belief that she could successfully manage a partially wild predator in an urban environment. The recent apartment relocation had triggered significant territorial stress in Zeus, whose 50% wild serval genetics made him far more sensitive to environmental disruptions than typical domestic cats. His 24-pound frame and wild instincts required extensive territory to feel secure, making the cramped studio apartment an inadequate environment for an animal designed to roam vast African grasslands. Rachel's irregular work schedule had disrupted established feeding and interaction routines, while the winter season had activated dormant hunting instincts that transformed routine movements into predatory assessments. Multiple factors had combined to create a dangerous situation in the small apartment. Zeus's wild serval genetics expressed themselves through territorial behaviors and heightened aggression, while the confined space prevented natural escape routes that would normally diffuse tension. The nocturnal timing coincided with Zeus's peak activity period, when his ancestral instincts were most responsive to movement and territorial challenges. Recent stress had shifted his perception of Rachel from caregiver to potential territorial competitor, requiring aggressive response. F1 Savannah cats represent first-generation crosses between domestic cats and wild African servals, retaining approximately 50% wild genetics that express themselves through size, strength, and predatory behaviors far exceeding normal domestic felines. Adult specimens typically weigh 15 to 25 pounds while maintaining the explosive speed that makes servals successful African predators. Territorial stress triggers the expression of wild survival instincts that can override domestic socialization, causing these hybrids to view owners as threats rather than caregivers during periods of environmental disruption. Rachel's 1:15 a.m. return coincided with Zeus's peak nocturnal activity period, when his serval genetics were most active and responsive to movement patterns. Her exhausted state and the prescription anticoagulant medication she had been taking for a recent medical condition created additional vulnerability, while the confined apartment space intensified territorial tension. Zeus's stress levels had reached critical points, transforming Rachel's familiar presence into a perceived threat, requiring aggressive territorial response. The attack began with Zeus targeting Rachel's thighs and legs with explosive aggression. One puncture wound to the upper inner thigh had nicked the femoral artery, resulting in uncontrolled bleeding that she was physically unable to manage. The anticoagulant medication prevented normal blood clotting, causing even moderate wounds to bleed heavily and continuously. Rachel's defensive movements and attempts to reach the bathroom to treat her injuries only intensified Zeus's territorial aggression, triggering sustained attacks that prevented her from applying effective first aid or reaching communication devices. The combination of deep puncture wounds, impaired blood clotting, and the inability to reach help caused progressive blood loss, exacerbated by anticoagulant medication and an untreated laceration to the inner thigh, while Zeus's continued aggressive territorial behavior reinforced her inability to access medical supplies or call for help. Her weakened condition from the medication and blood loss made it impossible to effectively defend herself or escape the confined space, while Zeus's 24-pound frame and wild strength repeatedly ambushed any attempt to move through the confined space, forcing her into defensive retreat. An elderly neighbor in the apartment below noticed unusual sounds and water-like stains on the ceiling that grew increasingly pronounced throughout the night, finally calling building maintenance at 6:30 a.m. when the disturbance became impossible to ignore. Building security discovered the scene and immediately contacted emergency services, though Rachel had already succumbed to uncontrolled hemorrhage following a femoral artery injury, compounded by anticoagulant medication and prolonged inability to reach help. Zeus was found in a defensive posture, his wild instincts still engaged and requiring professional animal control for safe removal. The incident prompted renewed scrutiny of hybrid animal ownership regulations in Washington state, reigniting debate over restrictions on first-generation wild domestic hybrids. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.